In other words, I live within that seemingly contradictory Christ, and that's that same God also who, who sometimes worked with Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar, and who might somehow find something of value to Trump in the advancement of his kingdom. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, those are political names you've just mentioned. And when Jesus first began to preach, what was he announcing? The incoming of the kingdom. And so this immediately puts us in attention. Correct? Because here is...
But the word kingdom itself is huge. I mean, implications. It's very militant. But go on.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's attention. Because you have this carpenter in this colony of the Roman Empire talking about a kingdom. And knowing that allegiance to another king and another kingdom is going to result in martyrdom. But here we are today where as Christians, evangelicals, people who are part of historic African American churches, people who are a part of dynamic Latino churches, we're wrestling with what is our role in society. And I think that as white evangelicals, we tend to personalize everything. So when I think about Easter and Jesus died on the cross, he died to be my own personal Savior. Others might say he died for the sins of the whole world. There's a systems way of thinking there. And so I think one challenge that we face as we follow this Jesus is, do we follow him into the world, where there were times where he challenged the status quo, or do we retreat? And it seems as though Jesus did both, didn't he? And I think that
my kingdom is out of this world, for example. You're saying, don't expect me to be fighting those battles.
And in a time where there was such an evil political system, Jesus spent very little time talking about the rulers of this world. Very little time talking about politics. It was the establishment of a new kingdom. And so what are the values of the new kingdom? Who's the leader of the new kingdom? The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. What does it mean to be citizens of these two worlds? I think that's where we find ourselves today, is how do we find this unity from people who are very different from one another in our own country and around the world, while at the same time being faithful in our societies.
But there's a different lens, because Jesus was all about politics, right? Jesus was about health care. He was healing people. Jesus was about social systems of welfare and making sure that everyone had provisions. I mean, the first thing that the disciples did when they come to Acts 2 is they made sure that those who had liquidated their assets in order to make sure those that didn't have had access to whatever they needed. That was what Jesus taught. Jesus looked around and he walked through the hills and the valleys. He went to the water, right? So he didn't necessarily just deal in the cities, right? And then he also visited people. He spoke to those who were alien. He spoke to those who were strangers, right? So there is a sense of immigration and people not being where they belong, in essence. And so in many ways, from a lens of people in the trenches, that's political, because we don't have access to the kings and the rulers. Some people don't even have access to the vote, right? So in order to express your way in the social, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual, that's political, right?
And to go beyond that, even as we speak about, who is Jesus, I would think, can we say that Jesus is also the letters of Paul? And that Jesus is also the letters of Jude or Peter, because I think, sometimes we compartmentalize Christianity into, the red letter Bible.
King James.
But I believe that the revelation of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, the mind, the frame of Jesus continues into the post-Jesus, quote unquote, the incarnated Jesus period of the church. And even continues to this day. So what I mean by that is that what we see, for example, in the book, as soon as we enter into the book of Acts, as soon as we continue into some of the ruminations of the Apostle Paul when he writes some of his pastoral letters, and we start talking about the structuring of the church, the governance of the church emerging slowly, the deacons and the elders of the church and the pastors and so on and so forth, and we begin to see there also this brain of the church wiring itself beyond Jesus. Now, as the Holy Spirit of Jesus is expressing himself through different decisions that the church makes, all of a sudden it becomes even more political. Because then you have, for example, Cornelius, one of the first Gentiles to be profiled. Really, in a way, it's almost like he's the first convert
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
that Gentile convert that serves as an example, as a paradigm. And who is he? He's a centurion. My God, I mean, he's a Roman centurion who didn't get to his rank by being a nice guy.
That's right.
Or by playing it fair.
Yeah.
I mean, he had to probably kill
They were pretty
a
tough
lot
guys.
of
Yeah, they were
people
pretty tough
and
guys.
had to really commit a lot of injustices to acquire the credibility. It's like being in the mafia.
Yeah.
You got to shoot some people and kill them before you're, made. And yet this is the guy that, God chooses to make an example of this encompassing Christ.
Yeah.
Who is now including, the Gentiles in there. Jesus himself healed, the servant of the centurion. Slavery, the whole issue of how Paul speaks about slavery. I know for a lot of African Americans, it's a problem the way Paul treats slavery.
Yeah.
And the way he says, hey, be submissive to your masters and, serve them really well and so on. Was Paul really supporting slavery? Or was he taking a much more expansive view of what would happen when the church short-circuited this institution of slavery by putting some slaves to become bishops of some slaveholders, actually, in the same church, and kind of creating an intellectual, cultural, a cognitive dissonance that would just, boom, short-circuit the whole system, as ended up happening. This church, in other words, this Christ that sees God working, over many, many different centuries, and playing with a chessboard that is almost infinite in the number of pieces that it handles. And so sometimes when we're seeing Trump right now, not to get too far out there, but bringing it down to where we are now, can Trump, for example, be just a little chess piece that God is moving within maybe a milli-inch of a space, but since we're deeply within that space, we think that this is something that is absolutely huge. But in the light of what God may be doing, positioning some other things to come about in the church and so on and so forth.
Of course.
How significant is it at all?
Course.
And should we be worried about it? In other words, how passionate should we be about that?
I think, of course,
that's what I'm trying to. It's complex God.
If God can use burning bushes and Red Seas that split in half and donkeys and all kinds of really peculiar situations, then clearly God can use a Trump. God can use individuals and figures all throughout the course of history. The question is, are we able to allow God to be God and we to be God's creation?
Yeah, and also just question the hell out of him as well if we need to. In other words,
and consistently.
I'm not advocating for.
Well, no, I'm not either.
This is a big long-term thing, and let's let him be whoever. No, I'm not saying that. That's why I want to hear pushback from you guys.
But I agree with you because this is not the end of the world. Right? Only God defines when the end of the world is. And every moment that we have a waking, drop of oxygen that we can breathe, I think we do need to interrogate God. But that means that we have to go closer to God to seek God's conscience, right? And so you can't pull away from God being angry and bitter at God, right? So God is big enough to deal with our anger, right? And so, yes, you have to have that discontent and that angst, right? And you have to bring it to God. I tell my congregants all the time that God is so ginormous that you cussing God out is okay.
Job,
if you do it, if you do it where God is present, right? But don't swear away.
He doesn't mind a little pushback. He doesn't at all. On the contrary, I think he just. I know you might be troubled with that dog because I know of your love for the oppressed, for the voiceless, and that's really what Civilitas really seeks to do. And your whole life, embodies that concern for the poor and so on. How are you processing this piece of the conversation?
Yeah, I'm realizing some of the challenges that we face.
Don't be afraid to express,
not at all.
It is.
I'm enjoying this, and I'm actually thinking about my experience as a missionary in Japan for 20 years. When there were many times when, as a young missionary who had an ambiguously clear sense of calling to Japan, I would think, why do they do that? The Japanese, because you see them in general terms, and then you begin to be able to differentiate groups in Japan. But there was a mystery. For one, I didn't speak the language. I didn't know the history of the people. I had studied it, but I hadn't entered into it. And so this really is a challenge, again, where in a sense it requires a type of a missionary anthropology. I need to understand your language. For example, as a white evangelical, I never heard anybody talk about Jesus being concerned about health care. When he healed a person, that was simply an act of compassion. Jesus was demonstrating his power.
Or it's a spiritual act. You know, some
Right,
people
right.
might just say, don't divorce it from the
but
whole
in your case,
healthcare
it's like it's
thing.
almost like you see this as the antecedents of Obamacare.